the Jalan committee. The central board took it on board and then decided upon this transfer based on that committee's recommendations. We should get some of those figures up on the screen so it's easier to absorb them. Let's start getting reactions straight off. Anant Narayan of SP Jain Institute of Management and Research, who's written extensively on this topic, is joining us straight off. Anant, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. You've read the release by now. Can you explain what you understand they've done both on the realized equity reserve side and then the overall size of the balance sheet?
Evening, Ira. Look, I haven't gone through this in detail. I must admit I'm traveling. But at least on the face of it, they have recommended that the reserve that the RBI holds on its balance sheet should be between 5.5% and 6.5% of its balance sheet. And the board has decided to keep it at the lower end at 5.5%, which results in this transfer of 50,000 crores into the government. Now, there's been a lot of debate about what the right number ought to be. I'll have to go through the report in some detail, to be honest, to be able to comment on that. But straight off, a couple of observations. One is, obviously, this is a bonanza for the government, probably more than the market was expecting in the last few days. Of this 1,76,000 crores, a bulk of it is the regular revenue coming in to the RBI from this year's revenue, which I'm not very sure how 1.23 lakh crores of revenue accrued to the RBI in this particular year. That's quite large, and we have to see how that came about. But yes, overall the market should be pretty happy. From my perspective, I'm glad that those large numbers of 3 lakh crores and 4 lakh crores that the market or some participants are talking about has not come about. 50,000 crores is neither here nor there. We can live with that kind of a number. I still think it's in the nature of monetization of the deficit, but that's okay. I mean, that's just pedantic me being kind of about the whole thing. What I am I will question and want to know more about is how this year's revenues came up to this very, very large number of 1.23 lakh crores.
No, absolutely, Anant. And I think the answer to that will only actually come when the annual report comes later in this week. So I will ask you one more question, though, about the realized equity part. So it stood at about 6.8%. The committee seems to have recommended 6.5 to 5.5, and the central board, in its judgment, has gone to the lower end. Now, globally, this would still be acceptable, right? I think a lot of people had made the point that the contingency reserves that we are sitting on are on the higher side. So if one uses that benchmark, even at 5.5, you think there wouldn't be alarm bells?
So personally, I would not be alarmed here. In fact, I would, without going into the report, I'm making a comment here, but I would make the case that even 5.5% is probably too high. Look, a bulk of the risks that the RBI faces is in the nature of revaluation of its assets. And the biggest asset it has, obviously, is its foreign currency reserve, the $430 billion today. Now, a lot of buffers already exist in respect of foreign currency reserves because of the large, very, very large revaluation reserves that the RBI carries on its balance sheet. So given that buffer, I would argue that the biggest risk is in a large sense mitigated, and therefore that even the 5.5% is on the larger side. But on an international basis, and Arvind Subramanian covered this well in the economic survey, we have central governments which follow all sorts of policies. We have central governments that have negative capital, and there are central banks like Norway, which have close to 30% of the balance sheet. So there is no real norm as such. In fact, I think Arvind made the case that it should be 14% of the balance sheet based on the median of all the central banks that have been observed. I don't think this will set off any alarm bells as such, but I will make the case that any transfer at this point in time, 50,000 crores that's being made right now, is actually deficit monetization. Because as I've argued earlier, any amount of reserves in the RBI's balance sheet has been deployed already into the assets held by the RBI, including government bonds held by the RBI. So at the moment, what you're seeing of the 50,000 by buying its bonds, and now they're transferring the money again to the government. But, this is pedantic beyond the point because 50,000 crores is neither here nor there. It's 0.2% of GDP or so. It doesn't really make a difference in the overall scheme of things. But that would be my take. I would still think that 5.5% is absolutely comfortable, no questions asked. I would still make the case that RBI has plenty of capital on its books, probably too much. And I would not make the case that there is case for an absolute transfer of a bigger amount to the RBI.
Okay, Anant, sort of last question, and we'll hope to have a more detailed conversation with you and once you're back, perhaps. So, how does bond market react to this? I mean, do they see this as a large fiscal bounty? Although, I have to question whether what this money can be used for. Should it be seen as a capital receipt? Can it be used for any, sort of expenditure that is in the budget this year? Like, for example, PSU Bank recapitalization, if they wanted to add to that, wouldn't that be a question too?
Let's take it in two parts. For bond markets, this is a positive. Remember, the budget talked about 90,000 crores coming in this year from the RBI. In reality, even if accounting for the 28,000 crores already transferred as interim dividend in the previous budget, we are seeing a significantly higher number come about. I guess about 95,000 crores for this year's revenues, plus the 50,000 crores is a one-time transfer. But to that extent, that eases the fiscal pressure on the government. It is good news for the bond market, and they should celebrate. We already had the bond market rallying in the last couple of days. I guess that trend will continue for tomorrow as well. In respect of what this can be used for, look, to the extent this is spionage income of the RBI going to the government, frankly, there ought not to be any restrictions of any kind. This can be used in the normal course of events. This is legitimate income of the government as the printer of money for the economy as a whole. And to that extent, I don't really see a problem. If this was a larger number, if this was a bigger transfer of 2 or 3 lakh crores, then absolutely the quality of where this money gets spent would be a question to ask. Broader point, I do think our fiscal deficit is far too much weight towards revenue expenditures. Is there a broader requirement that we shift money away from revenue expenditures to capital expenditures? Absolutely. But that's an independent discussion, irrespective of the nature of this particular transfer.
Anant, many thanks for taking our call, even though you're on the road. Really do appreciate it. Anant Narayan, who's written on this issue extensively, so we wanted to get him right off top. I'm going to go across to my colleague Nikunj Ori, who's actually been tracking this committee pretty much, through this. Nikunj, just give us a brief overview of what has emerged over this period of time. I think through our reporting, we know that there has been more than one iteration of this committee's report.
Right. So there were two set of reports that were finalized earlier. One which led to disagreement among panel members, and which recommended a lower surplus transfer to the government. And now the second set of report which suggested a higher transfer to the government, and which had agreement from all the panel members. Now, just to give you a sense of what the panel, the Bimal Jalan panel, has recommended. Firstly, there's a change in provisioning of risk that RBI would now do. The committee has suggested adopting an expected shortfall methodology under stress conditions. Now RBI will have to provide less for its risks as compared to the earlier stressed value at risk methodology. Now the expected shortfall methodology requires central banks to maintain expected shortfall at 99% confidence level. But now, since considering the macroeconomic conditions of India, the RBI has adopted maintaining a confidence level at 99.5% confidence level.
Okay,
so this would release some amount of capital that the RBI can transfer to the government.
Right, Nikunj. Thanks so much. We'll come back to you in a minute. I have Dr. Rakesh Mohan joining us. Who better to explain some of these recommendations? Dr. Mohan, thank you very much. This is Ira from the Bloomberg Quint Studios. So I'm just going to put a very basic question to you. What was the thinking of the committee? I'll put it into two parts. The first one being on the realized equity, the recommendations that you made there, sir.
Well, let me give you a broader background before coming to any numbers, okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Let me give you a broader background. First, let me just say that one of the issues that concerned us was that a lot of the discussion prior to the committee that had been going on, both starting, I suppose, with the economic survey a couple of years ago, where the discussion has been concentrated on the size of the liability side of the Reserve Bank's balance sheet. and focus then, of course, on risk measurement under different scenarios to measure the adequacy or excess of equity reserves. So there are two issues, I think, that are important in looking at the broad issue of the size of the balance sheet. First, that central bank balance sheets are consequences of the policy mandates. They do not determine policy action. It's the other way around. It is to the extent the Reserve Bank has a policy mandate to preserve the country's external financial stability, that it has to therefore have a significant degree of foreign exchange reserves. And second, of course, that it has a monetary policy mandate now, of course, under the Monetary Policy Committee and inflation targeting, and third, to maintain the financial stability of the country. So the balance sheet of any central bank and certainly Reserve Bank is then a consequence of such a policy mandate. Second, that, as I said, the discussions before the committee had almost exclusively concentrated on the liability side of the balance sheet, when in fact any balance sheet by definition has both asset side and liability side. So in our case, the asset side has foreign exchange reserves, what we call net foreign assets, and net domestic assets, which are essentially stock of government securities. And the net domestic assets, that stock of government securities, need to be used for operating the liquidity adjustment facility, for monetary policy purposes, to do OMOs, etc. And therefore, you need both foreign exchange reserves on the asset side as well as domestic assets in the form of government securities. Now, as it happens, in the last 10 years or so, the foreign exchange reserves or net foreign assets have formed between 60 to 90% of the total balance sheet on the asset side. Currently, they're around 70% of the balance sheet, if I remember correctly. One of the things and the way it goes up and down is that when there are high external inflows, obviously foreign exchange reserves go up. And when the low foreign exchange inflows, the domestic assets go up, as happened in 2018-19. Another interesting thing to understand is that the size of the RBI's balance sheet has been around 20% of nominal GDP over the past 10 years or so, on average. And what that means is that it's been growing roughly at around 10% a year for the last 10 years, to be exact, 9.7% a year. Roughly the same as the nominal GDP during this period over the last 10 years. So having said all that, what does that mean? That you have a balance sheet on the asset side of foreign exchange reserves plus domestic assets, and for the requirements of the economy, it has been expanding at around the same rate as nominal GDP. Now go to the liability side. What is the liability side of any central bank's balance sheet composed of? A large part of the liability side is indeed base money, which is currency plus bank deposits through CRR, etc. And in our case, it amounts to roughly 70% of the liability side. The rest of that is just under 30%, then amounts to the other liabilities, what we call non-monetary liabilities, plus minus 5% or thereabouts. So one principle that we used was that on the liability side, that because being Reserve Bank of India's balance sheet, the foreign exchange reserves are denominated in the whole balance sheet is denominated in rupees, and so the foreign exchange reserves on the asset side go up and down according to both the size of the foreign exchange reserves and also the value of the rupee. So if the rupee depreciates, there's nothing happening in some sense in the real size of the balance sheet in terms of dollars, but in terms of rupees, it increases. And therefore, we have a revaluation reserve, which is an accounting entity which accounts for the changes in the value of the rupee. Therefore, there's standard accounting principle that you do not distribute unrealized gains it's so we do not. So we observed the standard accounting principle that the revaluation reserves, which are essentially an accounting entity, they arise not from any realized gains, but basically market gains, the market accounting gains because of the changes in the value of the rupee with respect to the foreign exchange reserves. And therefore, one principle that we observed is that revaluation reserves cannot be distributed.
Okay.
And essentially they account for the market risk that the Reserve Bank faces, and therefore the market risk is then well taken care of by the revaluation reserves. The issue then boils down to looking at the other non-monetary liabilities, how much do you need? And the report gives a detailed accounting of how we arrived at that number, and that number came to around 5.5 to 6.5% of the balance sheet. So I think I hope that is reasonably clear and that I've been able to explain the very, very broad principles of the committee's approach.
Absolutely. So the unrealized gains, which is the revaluation reserve, nothing changes there, sir. Not not in terms of how it's calculated or how it's accounted for. What changes is simply the realized equity part,
right.
and that is you have given a band of 5.5 to 6.5. The central board has taken it down to 5.5 immediately.
Yeah, they've taken the lower bound.
What was the rationale, or what were the conditions under which, according to you, the reserves should be maintained at the upper bound and the lower bound? And how do you think we compare globally, sir?
Well,
even at the lower bound, they're comfortable?
Well, first, another point to make actually is that I personally actually did, and the committee did, look at the practices of other central banks. And one very, very important point to understand is that there are no international standards on this issue among central banks. And I've personally looked at a number of balance sheets and their practices, mainly because the policy mandates differ significantly, and especially to do with the maintenance of foreign exchange reserves. So comparing the kind of economic capital the Reserve Bank has with other central banks is actually not very useful, as has been done by many observers, by many analysts in the past. You really have to look at your own situation. On the issue of whether you take the upper bound or the lower bound is really the central board has to look at the expectation of risk materializing or not materializing. And looking at the market situation both in the country and abroad, and then deciding on that how much risk, meaning domestically actually, on what kind of risk you want to maintain and what kind of risk reserves you want to maintain.
There was a time, Dr. Mohan, although acknowledging that it was very, very long back, that a 12% number had been talked about for contingency reserves. I think it was a 1997 report. Those benchmarks are far outdated now, sir?
Well, there's 20 years have gone by, and the Reserve Bank balance sheet has changed completely since then. So those were useful to look at. They've also all the various reports the Reserve Bank has had on this issue have been very good reports. But as times have changed, I think that I hope that the Reserve Bank releases the full report that we have submitted, and I think it'll become clear how we arrived at all the numbers.
I hope so too, sir. I have a couple of questions specifically on the report. But, sir, the other part of the transfer that have been announced today is this 1,23,000 crore for 2018-19. Now, what the central board says is, since the balance sheet, so it says that since the RBI's economic capital levels were lying within the range of 24.5 to 20%, the economic capital as of June 30 at 23% was seen as comfortable. As such, they have transferred the entire income of the current year to the government. So this is, sir, an ordinary course of business. This has nothing to do with what the committee had recommended or not?
Yes and no, in that the committee has said that, look, suppose the risk reserves were lower than the lower bound that we have given, then the idea would be that you transfer, you retain you retain a part of the surplus so that you meet the lower bound of the reserves that we have specified. And since that is being met, then of course you can transfer the rest of it.
Okay. Dr. Mohan, I mean, I know this is not a question that should go to you, but I'm just going to try and get your understanding. In a year like this, what would have contributed to such a large income for the Reserve Bank of India? Because in previous years, surplus transfers have been in the range of 50-60,000 crore. I don't think it's gone very much above 65,000 odd crore. How would it be 1,23,000 crore this year?
Well, I haven't seen the accounts, obviously, since they've just been submitted to the board today. So I'm not privy to those. But I think there's a reasonably simple answer that the Reserve Bank did a very large amount of OMO last year, 2018-19, amounting to almost 70% of all of total government borrowing. And therefore, the stock, the proportion, the absolute stock, and of course the proportion of government securities on the asset side went up significantly. And therefore, you have a higher, and of course, since the domestic securities, the government securities, have a significantly higher interest rate than the foreign securities, and therefore you get a larger surplus. Okay. Larger revenue and larger surplus.
Okay, so it could be just normal
larger
course
interest revenue. I would assume, because as I said, I've not seen the accounts, but that would be the logical explanation.
Okay. Dr. Mohan, on the committee, its deliberations and its report, we don't have the final report yet, but I think much was spoken about the fact that the government nominee had a different viewpoint. Does the committee take into account two separate viewpoints, and is this the majority view rather than the consensus view, sir?
No, this is a totally unanimous report and signed by all the 6 members, including the government nominee.
Which is Mr. Garg.
And of course, has been No, the government nominee now was Mr. Rajiv Kumar, the Secretary for Financial Services.
I see. So an earlier dissent note, sorry, just to check, was no longer the government's view. Is that the way it worked?
I won't comment on that, except just to say that the final report that we have submitted is a totally and utterly unanimous report with the concurrence of the government nominee, Mr. Rajiv Kumar, the Secretary of Financial Services as well. And of course, he's also a member of the Reserve Bank Board. And the fact that the Reserve Bank Board, which has 2 government nominees, the Secretary of Economic Affairs, the Secretary of Financial Services, according to the press release, has accepted the report in total, there is clearly a unanimous report acceptable to both the government and the Reserve Bank.
Okay, and you would dispel any fears, the headline number is large, but when you break it up and look at the transfer that is happening on account of the committee's recommendations, it's relatively small. You would dispel any fears that this is a raid on the central bank's balance sheet, Dr. Mohan?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a lot.
As far as I can understand just looking at the press release, I'll again repeat that I don't have yet access to the final accounts of the Reserve Bank for 2018-19 because they were just submitted to the board today, and I am now in the US. So I've not seen that, but just looking from the press release, it would seem that they have followed the report of the committee.
All right. Dr. Mohan, last question. Should there be or will there be any caveats on how the government can use this money? I ask only because there was this discussion going into the report that if it's a large one-time transfer, it should be seen as a capital receipt, cannot be used for regular budget purposes. Is there any such caveat in the report on what the government can use this for?
No, the report has no comment on that particular issue. However, I can say not from the committee's point of view, but from my own understanding of the system, that any surplus distribution from the Reserve Bank is indeed current revenue for the government.
All right. Dr. Mohan, thank you very much. Very, very kind of you to take the time to explain the findings of the committee and the recommendations. That's Dr. Rakesh Mohan joining us from the US and that committee report. The full report is not out, but the Central Board has told us what they've accepted. I'm going to reiterate that for the purpose of our viewers before we go on to try and understand what the market impact of this is going to be. The total amount of transfer is 1.76 lakh crore, but you have to see that transfer in 2 and actually maybe 3 parts. One part of it is 52,600 1.637 crore, which is the excess provisions that have been identified by the Jalan committee, and that is being transferred to the government. The surplus for the year, seemingly in ordinary course of business for the Reserve Bank of India, is 1.23 lakh crore. Now that 1.23 includes a 28,000 crore already transferred. So net, the additional amount that will be transferred to the government will be to the tune of 1.48 lakh crore. Now I think in the budget, the government had accounted for about 1 lakh crore from the category of RBI plus financial institutions. So they get a little bit more than that. And of course, they have plenty of uses that they can put it to. Manish Vadhavan, fixed income expert, joining us on the phone line. Manish, thanks so much for taking our call at this time. How do markets react? This is, well, a bounty.
Yeah, Ira, definitely I think market will take it positively. There was some kind of a rally which happened today around 11 basis points because this report was expected to be released today. There were a lot of expectations. You might see that rally continuing tomorrow also because of this. But I would just, although I know Dr. Rakesh Mohan was there and he gave in all the details on your program. But if you look at the numbers, if you decipher, the only thing which was extraordinary in this report is today, the current year's surplus, which is touted to be at 1,23,000 crores. But for that, the amount of 52,637 crores would have been taken in a very par for course because the expectations initially were very, very high. I think the details have already been discussed so many times on your show now. I won't get into that. This is, I think, there was no template available for the financial markets also, that this kind of a thing. This is the first time the markets have seen this. I think it is partly positive, irrespective of what the rally has happened today. And the amount seems to be quite reasonable in terms of what the fiscal situation of the government is. So that should be helpful for bond markets tomorrow.
Manish, so you wouldn't expect any, I'll call it loose talk, but, you can't say that it doesn't happen. Will people worry about the fact that, central bank's reserves are being dipped into, etc.? Because as Anand, who spoke to us a little while back, said that, the optics of the situation coming at a time when the government is struggling on the fiscal side will not be great.
Yeah, I don't think so. And frankly, even I'm not trying to be diplomatic here also, but looking at the numbers and looking at the semantics, what they're talking about, and the new parameters which they have set in terms of, the risk provisioning at 99% confidence level or oblique the size of realized equity and the surplus distribution policy. That is why I'm saying if you look at it, the number of 52,637 crores is actually quite nominal. It's not very high. Yeah, there is definitely a surprise in terms of could the surplus of this year be 1,23,000 when we have seen the average numbers to be around 60, 65 or 50 to 65 for the last, so many years. But I think it's definitely is an outcome of what the OMOs which have been done by RBI this year. Yeah, and so I don't think that there is even iota of doubt or this kind of a question comes up that our government has dipped into the reserves of RBI. This seems to be quite a rational report, what I would read as, whatever I've understood. Okay,
Manish, thanks so much. Really, thanks for that quick reaction. Just going across now as a final voice to Mr. H.R. Khan, former RBI Deputy Governor. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Sir, your thoughts on what is initial recommendations, some transfer on account of the Jalan Committee recommendations, and a very large surplus of 1,23,000 crore for this year, sir?
So surplus is the outcome of whatever the operations and investments RBI would have done. So there is no issue of large. So whatever is the surplus they must have transferred, and some methodology has been indicated by Jalan Committee in terms of resilience. And the press release says, I had a quick look, that we are one of the highest resilient central banks. So and beyond that, they have for the equity they have given a range between 5.5 to 6.5 equity capital. Should be there. So I think based on that, the entire surplus they would have transferred. I think this 123 will include 28 interim dividend, which they have already paid last financial year. So I believe this year government has projected 1 lakh. So they are almost getting this plus surplus from the previous period is almost 52,000. So I think 1,47,000, 1,48,000 crores. So I think RBI alone is more than what government has estimated. And I think it's a good compromise. Because whatever we are hearing earlier, the strong resistance from the government, they wanted
some figure of 2 lakh, 3 lakh, 4 lakh was being talked about. But I think they have taken a prudent and tactical approach and struck a middle ground, ensuring that the RBI's resilience is maintained. At the same time, if there is some surplus available in terms of realized gain, and that should be transferred to the government. The only thing I didn't see in the press release, that there was a talk about creating a buffer and releasing a dividend over a period of time for dividend smoothing. So this year we have given huge 1,23,000. Next year it may not be possible to transfer 1,23,000. So probably they could have created a buffer, dividend smoothing buffer. But unless we see the details, we can't make really detailed comment. But the amount itself transferred is not very large. So possibly that is the reason that's why they have not created a dividend distribution redemption sort of reserve.
Okay. Mr. Khan, just one more question. This the surplus, the 1,23,000 surplus, so that would be just on account of OMOs? Would there be other factors which would have allowed for a very large income?
Factors because OMO is one, and because the domestic balance sheet would have gone up. And in the yield income, I think now rupee asset, the RBI's balance sheet has gone to 41 trillion, 15% increase. So in that asset side, rupee assets would have earned dividend income. So that is one, and liquidity of present, they would have earned a lot of money from the repo. Plus on the foreign side also, they would have got something. Plus, since rupee has depreciated in terms of conversion, they would have got some gain. And my hunch is that there has been some talk about RBI valuing its foreign exchange in terms of weighted average cost. If the weighted average cost would have taken, they would have got little more into that profit and loss account. But I'm not sure whether this has been implemented this year or not implemented.
Okay.
But my sense is that increased rupee portfolio because of OMO, so more yield income, more rupee repo operations, and maybe because of this weighted average computation on foreign exchange gain. Because in foreign exchange also, they would have been in yield reserve size also has increased. So the coupon has also must have added to all this bonanza of sort of a profit this year.
All right, Mr. Khan, thank you so much, sir, for taking the time to speak to us. That's H.R. Khan, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. All right, we'll close off this programming again with the reminder that look at this number with a cool head. 1.76 lakh crore is being transferred, which is a record surplus to be transferred to the government. Only about 52,637 crore out of that is a result of the Jalan Committee report recommendations. The 1.23 lakh crore, which is a large amount, seems to be coming from ordinary course of business, and the answer to that will finally come when the RBI puts out its annual report, which should also happen this week, because then you know what the RBI's actual accounts look like, and you know where that large surplus came from. Thanks for watching Bloomberg Quint. Do go on to bloombergquint.com. We'll have the news up, and we'll have a lot of this commentary up on the website as well.